Okay, when I want to step further back, I want to talk about first about where I grew up, because I grew up in South Central Los Angeles in a very diverse ethnic community. Although when I looked at my first grade photograph, which is actually plastered on the building on Crenshaw Boulevard in Los Angeles right now, because it is exemplary of what the community used to look like. And I just counted yesterday or the day before. In that photograph, there's 15 blacks and 15 Asians and 4 or 5 whites. So my elementary school and my middle school were quite ethnically diverse, but during my middle school years is when the Watts riots happened in 1964. And because of the Watts riots was, there was a police who arrested a young man, and there was considered police oppression. And it was a very hot summer when there was very high unemployment, um, disparities with housing and education in the community. And so that police oppression sparked a big riot in Southern California, in South Central Los Angeles. So our house was in a vicinity of that those rioting, and so we experienced a lockdown or a curfew for about a week. And then because of the Watts riots, all the white people living in the community, they all either moved out or they sent their children to outlying schools. So that my high school was predominantly Black and Asian, and in my graduating high school class, there was 4 white people. Um, so I think we all got along well together. There were gangs, but the Blacks were fighting the other Black gangs, and the Asians were fighting within their own Asian gangs. But when I went to UCLA, um, that's where I did my first 2 years, I was searching for something different, something new. I could not relate to the sororities and the fraternities. And this was a time of the anti-war movement. So I actually first got involved with the Asian community with a newspaper, which is a radical newspaper at the time called Ghidra. And it started around 1968. And originally, Ghidra was started by UCLA students who wanted to write and talk about issues affecting Asian Americans on campus. But it later spread to talking more about the Asian American experience in Los Angeles area, and then spreading even further to talk about the anti-war movement, anti-capitalism, anti-imperialism, and aligning itself with other ethnic community groups and organizations, and also aligning itself with organizations with the same opinions abroad. Um, so, and then at the same time, I also got involved with Amerasia Bookstore. Amerasia Bookstore was established, I think, in 1970 or 1970 or 71. And this was the first bookstore in the United States to house literature for and by and about Asians in America. So initially it was also to kind of be a bookstore for Asian American studies at the university campuses, but it became a kind of a community center in its own right. It wasn't a confirmed community center by the community, but it was a place where artists and musicians could show their work, and writers could come, poets could come, and we would give talks, and they would give readings. We had concerts by Asian Americans. We had film showings, and yeah, and this was in Little Tokyo, um, in Los Angeles. And people would come and just hang out at the bookstore. Um, and it was just uh, it was actually kind of revolutionary at the time, as was Gidra newspaper. And you asked me about how activism was related to Taiko. Actually, at this time, um, Johnny Mori and also George Abe were also involved in Amerasia Bookstore. And I remember them talking about um, putting the taiko away one time after Obon, and then they were just jamming and having a great time. And I thought it sounded really interesting, but I never experienced taiko at that time. I was very much involved in the bookstore and the newspaper. Um, so besides being involved in these two organizations, people of like mind were searching alternative lifestyles. So the Amerasia Bookstore people got a house, and we lived together. And we had political education meetings like once a week, as well as the bookstore had these meetings. And we would also have meetings about male chauvinism and sorry, there's some kind of a call that I'll turn my phone down. Sorry. Um, uh, Women's issues, uh, political issues, anti-war movement issues, anti-capitalism, anti-imperialism. Um, so we had political meetings and discussion groups. The same thing with the Gidra. Gidra also had a house, the newspaper, and they were just 2 doors down. And they also did the same thing. And there was another house in the neighborhood, also of a group of Asians called the West Side Collective. And I would say that they were a little bit more serious political activists. And they also did the same thing, had these meetings, weekly meetings, and discussing how they can improve themselves and improve relations between each other, and also talking about racism and anti-war, etc. Um, so uh, all this was happening in the late 60s and early 70s. And after being involved in these organizations, actually, I actually dropped out of college because during the anti-war movements at UCLA, um, there was police brutality on the campuses. This is a time where some students were shot at Kent State University, and also I think it's called Jackson State University. But I was also involved in a protest at UCLA, which was the anti-war movement, where the police were charging at us with batons and hitting people. And I just remember running and having to like jump over a cement wall. And one of the fellows in our Gidra office, he was arrested for having rocks in his pocket. But at that time, UCLA instructors were also sympathetic to the anti-war movement, and they said that if you wanted to take the grade that you got at midterm, you can accept that grade and then go out and protest and demonstrate. So I chose to do that in some of my classes, and then I ended up dropping out of college and spending a year working within the community. So during that time, I was mainly working with Amerasia Bookstore, which was housed in Little Tokyo in Los Angeles, and Gidra, which is located on Crenshaw Boulevard. I'm sorry, on Jefferson Boulevard in the Crenshaw district of Los Angeles. So then after a year, I decided to go back to school, and I ended up going way up to Northern California near the Oregon border to Humboldt State, and there there was hardly any Asians. In fact, I remember only being maybe one or two other Asians up there at the time. So it was a completely different atmosphere. And instead, actually, I got very involved with Native American people and got interested in their philosophy and in their ceremonies and their shamanism and their ceremonies. Yeah, I said that. Um, so during that whole time I was up in Humboldt, I kept hearing about Taiko. But since I was far away, I was not able to experience it. So it wasn't until I finished college and came back to Los Angeles that I actually saw Taiko for the first time. And for me, having come out of this experience with Native American people, um, what struck me about Taiko was that it hit me in uh, my soul, I guess, the same way that the Native American culture had affected me. And I also spent about a couple months traveling with the interpreter for the Hopi traditional leaders. He's actually a quite famous man. And we traveled up the West Coast going to different ceremonies, and he would give many speeches about the Hopi prophecies. And from at that time, I was really wanting to devote my life to working with Native people and learning more about their culture. But spending time with him, I realized that I needed to come back to my own culture. And so when I first saw Taiko, actually, it struck me, like I said, in my center, in my soul, which was a very similar feeling to what I had with the Native people in their ceremonies. Um, and so I wasn't attracted to it because it was Japanese, but just because of what it made me feel, how it made me feel. And then I thought, oh, it's great because it is Japanese, so that works out. So one thing I also learned from the Native American people was that I attended a ceremony once, and I was just so amazed at it was so beautiful the way that this spiritual leader was talking and how much respect uh, the culture had for all living things, and not only living things but non-living things as well. So he talked about how the sun gave us sunshine and warmth and helped the plants to grow, and being respectful for the plants who uh, gave us oxygen and also fed us, and a respect for the water and the animals, and then also people. And so I felt at that time that that was one thing that was absent in American culture. It was respect for all living and all non-living things. So since that time, I really felt that that was something that I wanted to um, do in my life, was to teach children to be respectful. So that is one thing that is very important, has been very important uh, in my teaching of Taiko and in our school. Um, I think it was Kenny that started saying that we need to be respectful. We bow at the door to show respect to our teachers and the dojo, the classroom, the art form, to know where the art form came from, and the teachers, to the other students in the class, to our instruments, and also to yourself. so that has been a very important aspect that I felt I could teach through Taiko. Also, I remember being with San Francisco Taiko Dojo. I think it was around 1980, and we went to Vancouver to perform there. And Masato Baba was just a little baby at the time. And I often took care of him because before that trip, oftentimes when there was a San Francisco Taiko Dojo performance, his mother, Jeannie, would be performing. And when I was not yet performing with the group, I would be watching Masato. But I just remember that Vancouver trip and him being so small and thinking how wonderful it would be to grow up with Taiko. Because for me, Taiko, as we know it today, kumidaiko, ensemble drumming, did not exist when I was a kid. You know, the Taiko drum was in America when the immigrants first came, but it was in the Buddhist temples or in the Shinto shrines. But kumidaiko didn't come to the United States until 1968 with San Francisco Taiko Dojo. So that was after I was actually pretty much grown up. And just seeing how little kids were so excited about the Taiko drum, I just thought how wonderful it would be to be able to grow up with this. And at that time, there were no kids groups. There were no kids playing Taiko. 1980, yeah, 1980. There were no kids yet playing Taiko. So that has been very important for me as far as being active with Taiko, is to teach respect and also to just share this wonderful art form with them, because it was not something that I had growing up. Growing up, you know, the Japanese art forms were ikebana, flower arrangement, or the martial arts. Went to Japanese school, Nihon Buyo, Japanese classical dance. I did that, but actually, when I saw the Taiko, it was unlike any other Japanese art form that I had seen before. And as a Japanese woman, we really couldn't express ourselves outwardly like that until Taiko, I really felt. I mean, maybe martial arts, but my mother used to even tell me that when she was growing up, she was not allowed to whistle because that was only boys could whistle. Yeah. So I want to show you this one photo.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so there are these women that this photograph came out in the women's issue of the Gidra newspaper magazine. And this was, we look pretty tough, I think. And if you look at the girl in the middle, she's
Uh-oh.
there. The reason of this photograph, and you can't really see this, but there was a leaflet. This is a copy of a leaflet that was being passed around in the US military. This was around the Vietnam War era. And the leaflet said, anyway, it's about a book that you could get on how you can meet and get Asian women. Yeah, so they make great housekeepers and wives because they're so obedient. And so this book was going to show you how to meet them and get them and date them, etc. And so all you had to do is respond to this newsletter. I mean, this little leaflet. And so this was our response to that leaflet. Yeah, I think activism at that time, we we participated in protests, and some of us voiced our opinions through literature, through writings, and working on this magazine newsletter. Um, and then also, just like you're doing right now, is gathering people together to talk, to educate yourself, and then hopefully those people will go out and educate others. And education is very important. Yeah. Well, like I said, I've been spending the last couple weeks at my mother's house cleaning out things from my elementary school days, but coming across textbooks and writings that I wrote and things that I was reading in the 60s and 70s, and it's all the same kind of things that's still going on today. Um, Racism, um, police brutality, police oppression, anti-imperialism, anti-capitalism. It's all the same thing. And and I saw one article that was written at that time that said things are not getting better; they're getting worse. And so, you know, there's these uprisings that keep happening. I mean, after the Watts riots, and then there was Rodney King. I think maybe since Rodney King, this might be one of the biggest ones, and this is definitely the biggest one. Um, I feel like there's potential for making more change now because I think the movement has grown. And I also think that the LGBTQ movement has helped uh, because there's an affinity with what's going on today. And I think that there's more people who can relate to um, and want to understand what's happening today. Yeah, I feel like there's potential to make a little bit of change, but I think it takes a long time because it's been going on for so long, and the disparities between the rich and the poor, black and white. Um, what I think we need to do is educate ourselves, educate each other, educate, grow the alliances. I think uh, we need to get people in position of power. And I think that's what happened in my day when we were protesting, is that eventually the, the violence subsided, and many people started to work within the system. And so people getting into the education system and getting into the police force, getting into government, and trying to make change that way. So I think that's all very important. I don't know. um, I think what I did say earlier about the LGBTQ community, I think that they are also empowering this movement. Um, yeah, working within our own communities and trying to educate, trying to support each other, trying to form alliances with other groups. I don't know, with this pandemic, um, I don't see us surfacing from the pandemic for a couple of years. I feel like this is just something that we have to learn how to live with. So it's a struggle. And that word struggle is, we used it all the time in the 60s and 70s. And I feel that this is where we're at. And we're all in this together. Um, Nobody knows what they're really doing. um, and people are complaining because even in our Department of Education, They're complaining, the teachers are complaining because the people at the top of the Department of Education are not making decisive decisions that are looking out for the safety of the children and the teachers. But nobody knows how to move forward. We're all having difficulty moving forward because things seem to be getting better. And in fact, our Department of Education said that once there are no more um, COVID-19 cases for 2 weeks, then we will come back to school. But that's not happening, and the numbers are rising. So they're trying to figure out what they're doing when they're making concessions and possibly not as safe as it could be for the kids and the teachers. So it's just a very difficult situation that we're in, and I don't know the answer, but I think we just need to keep talking, and hopefully as a collective group, we will be able to, I don't know if it's to find some answers as a collective group. But I think there are many opportunities for activism at this time. There's so many terrible things going on in the world today that have been going on for a really long time. And some people have benefited at the expense of others. So what you put your energy into is all up to you. But to make change, one has to change within oneself first. And that requires a lot of self-reflection and learning about others, and not only people, racism, police brutality, inequalities, but also about what's going on in the world as well. For example, global warming and land desecration. And talking to others and learning from others is very important. So what everyone is doing, coming to these meetings right now, is a step in the right direction, I think. And change starts from each one of us. So please, I say, just keep on being inquisitive and talking to people, getting together and talking to each other, and hopefully we can make some change for the future, not only for ourselves, but for our children.